Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes before we kick things off, so we appreciate your patience. Thank you. Okay, we are going to get things started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining HCD's webinar. Excited to have you all here this afternoon. I'm going to get a few housekeeping items out of the way. You can ask questions during the questions and answers section of the webinar. You will see there is the Q&A tab on the platform, and Michelle will address these at the conclusion of her presentation. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with you all by the end of the week. So let me officially kick things off with an introduction about HCD and your speakers. I am Marcella Markman, EVP at HCD. I have been with HCD for almost 15 years with a focus on business development and research design across multiple industries. As we've evolved with new technologies and techniques, I've enjoyed the challenge and excitement of integrating them into the traditional methods that I based my career in. I'm most passionate about bringing information, insights, and analytics to our clients to make actionable and innovative ideas. I believe we need to always consider the way we are listening to our audience in order to create meaningful solutions. Dr. Michelle Murphy-Niedziela is a behavioral neuroscience expert in neuropsychology, psychology, and consumer science. She obtained a PhD and master's in neuroscience and biopsychology from Purdue University. She has over 10 years of consumer product research experience at large companies such as Johnson & Johnson's and Mars Chocolate. At HCD, Michelle focuses on integrating applied consumer neuroscience, neuromarketing tools with traditional methods. So she will be presenting the meat of the presentation today, and as well as walking you through a case study. But I'm going to give you a little background to HCD as well. HCD has been in business for almost 30 years, where we have been a traditional research house, but with a focus on innovation through technology and methodology. For a number of years, we've specialized in communications research, with a recent focus in the product development space. We evaluate the consumer's holistic experience with products, from their key attributes through the commercialization process. We're grounded in traditional research and academically sound methodologies when integrating technology. This isn't about using a technology just to add some flair, but determining the best suited approach based on your research question. I believe that is what makes our offering unique and differentiating. And as I know, we've had several international participants today. All these methodologies Michelle will walk you through are conducted globally. So we typically do use a multimodal approach when answering your research questions, things including the neuroscientific, traditional, and psychological and behavioral techniques. You can see them listed here as well, but the list goes beyond. As our goal is in developing new products and innovative approaches, we are very excited to introduce our patent-approved data visualization technique, which we have titled the HCD Mood Map. Michelle will walk you through these details, but this is the first of what we hope to be many future patents to come. The mood mapping technology helps to clearly demonstrate the consumer emotional experience for both communications and products. Creating a cohesive emotional impact in both the product experience and the communication increases market success and consumer delight. A mismatch between product experience and brand expectations can lead to challenges in product acceptability and liking, begging the development of new approaches and methodologies that can offer more insightful consumer understanding of synergistic effects. The case study that Michelle will walk through was shared this summer at the 13th Pangborn Sensory Science Conference in Edinburgh, UK. In a workshop alongside the European Sensory Network with Coty and Firmenich, we demonstrated how we can measure consumer neurophysiological response to a fine fragrance perfume and the perfume advertisement to determine if the two experiences were in alignment. So without further ado, let me hand things over to Michelle to walk you through the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, this is Michelle here, and I will be walking you through a couple of things here, a little bit of background. I know some people that are participating on the call do have some experience with applied neuroscience or neuromarketing, as you might have heard of it, but I thought I'd ground us all with a bit of knowledge on understanding what applied neuroscience is, or consumer neuroscience, or sometimes it's called neuromarketing, or it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I like to define it as the knowledge of all that esoteric, anatomic, cellular, and signal processing that we use to understand consumer interactions with products and communications. Now, that's not the most flattering definition, and it sounds really complicated, but that's because neuroscience is a really complicated field. So it's basically what this is saying is that neuromarketing, or applied consumer neuroscience, is based on academic research of how the brain works and how our body responds to the information around us, and then how we can take that very academic information and translate it into some sort of consumer and applied work. Now, over the years, the term neuromarketing has actually dropped out of popularity, and in came more of the behavioral economics approach of replacing neuromarketing with the idea of looking at system one, which may be a term that you're familiar with, and more recently describing it as behavioral science. We still prefer to call it applied consumer neuroscience or applied neuroscience, as that seems to be the most descriptive way to describe what we do. But why do it at all? Why would you want to look at measures that are looking at the brain or psychology or physiological response? Well, The main reason is to better understand consumers' thought processes. So how do people see, interpret, and behave and interact with the world around them? Well, instead of dividing up the conscious and the non-conscious, we actually view it more as a continuum, which most neuroscience and psychologists do. So instead of saying that they're totally separate, which they aren't, they actually communicate with each other to help you make your decisions in the world around you. It's really more of a continuum of experiencing the world first non-consciously, and then your brain processes that information until you just decide how to act or behave with the information that your body has received. So you might think of that as being, maybe the sounds or the touch or the textures, the smells that you experience around you. Your brain recognizes those signals, gives it a value and a meaning. And as you deliberate and tease apart what that meaning is, that helps you to decide what you're going to do about it. An example we like to use is if your cell phone was ringing. That's a sound that the hair cells in your ear would hear, and they would trigger a neural response that would send a signal to your brain. You would not be aware of this. This would be happening on the non-conscious side. As your brain determines a meaning and value, saying, okay, that's a sound, the sound is nearby, and then you start to recognize and deliberate and analyze what that sound specifically is, and you say, oh, it's a cell phone, and then you say, oh, it's my cell phone, and then you decide what you're going to do. That's a conscious activity. So that sort of decision-making process is a conscious activity that was based on information that came in through the non-conscious. And so the important thing about being able to understand that non-conscious side is that you may be able to better tease apart the different inputs to see, okay, if I change something about that ringtone, or I change something about the colors that the person is seeing or the texture that they're feeling, how is that going to affect their overall decision making? And that's why this sort of approach can be really useful, because that sort of thing is not necessarily something that someone can tell you. Now, we also view the consumer experience as being a 5-dimensional experience, meaning that all these things that we experience in the world, the sounds, the touch, the taste, the smells, all of those things are opportunities for clients to communicate with a consumer. The colors that we see, the sounds that we hear, all those things can affect our mood, arousal, and the context we actually perceive the stimulus to be in. So, are we going to see it as being a happier event or a more somber event? Is it exciting or is it relaxing? Is it something in a particular context, like are we in some sort of social situation or a more private situation? All these things can be communicated through the senses. And by understanding that experience better, we can develop better products, packaging, experience, and ultimately communications. And all these things really need to work together so that we can better understand how to create an ideal consumer experience. So with that background, how do you go about measuring these sort of things? There's a lot of different approaches that are used. And as Marcella showed earlier, we use a lot of different approaches as well. If you're looking for more neuroscience and physiological based research, EEG, fMRI, and EEG measure, another type of EEG, as you can see here, there are 2 different types. One is more complicated and one is more simplified, are measures of the brain activity. More peripheral or behavioral measures can be seen on the bottom. Popular ones are facial coding, biometrics, eye tracking, and implicit reaction time, or IET. So these are the more popular approaches that can be used, and they all have different purposes. We're going to be focusing on the biometrics, mainly because that one is the gold standard. And I'll explain in just a second why we consider that to be the gold standard. So the gold standard of biometrics include heart rate or heart rate variability, which is a measure of attention, GSR, which is a measure of arousal, and emotional valence, which can be used, can be measured through facial EMG. You can also add eye tracking to that set to better understand the behavior of where someone's looking. Now, the reason this is called the gold standard is because these particular measures have direct correlations to what we say they're measuring. So there isn't a lot of noise When you measure brain activity, there's a lot of activity going on. Your brain is not concentrating on one activity at a time. While you're, making a decision about which yogurt to buy, you're also maintaining your heartbeat and your breathing and standing upright. And all of that is activity in the brain. And so sorting through all that mess can be really complicated and difficult. But when you measure something like heart rate variability, GSR, or facial EMG, you are measuring exactly what you're looking for. And there's 50 or so years of, or even more, of academic research out there supporting the physiological emotions that are elicited by stimuli that can be measured through these different measures. So heart rate, for example, focused attention, it's an inverse relationship. Heart rate variability, you can look at cognitive performance and relaxation. GSR, or galvanic skin response, is arousal, and facial EMG, which are the electrodes placed on the face, can give you a measure of emotional valence, or how positive or negative the person is feeling. So with that gold standard, with these direct measures of the emotional experience, you can passively measure what's going on with a consumer as they're experiencing something, be it a communication like a media or a fragrance or a consumer product, packaging, or whatever it might be. But of course, this type of research can still be very complicated. And so looking back at psychological research that's been done in the past on psychological theory of emotion, we started to apply a multidimensional mood map to these measures. So using this multidimensional approach by dividing up the arousal, how intense or mild the experience is, the pleasantness, or how pleasant or unpleasant the experience is, positive or negative, and the attention that's not shown here because this is a 2D map, we're able to get an emotional map of what's going on with the consumer when they're experiencing maybe a test stimuli or some sort of benchmark, whatever it might be. So here you can see we can start to map out that as the person is feeling more pleasant, they would go towards the right. And as they're feeling more intense or aroused, it'd be going up on this scale. And then if you were to map out different test samples, you could see where one might be more pleasant than the other. So here you can see if something were experienced more pleasantly and intensely, you could describe that as being happy, right? Whereas if something was more unpleasant and also intense, you could describe the person as feeling angry. But you could also describe that same person who's feeling unpleasant and very aroused or intense as being afraid. So we do know there's a big difference between fear and anger, and that's where that third measure really comes in to help out to differentiate that emotional experience. When you are afraid of something, you tend to retreat from it, whereas when you're angry at something, you tend to be more approaching it. So we can use this measure to further differentiate the experience, whether it's fear or anger, or if it's just a product that is two products that are very close to one another. Having that third measure can help separate and differentiate that emotional experience. So why is this important? Well, when we look at market performance of different products, consumer products, or even marketing ads, and all sorts of things that consumers experience out there in the world, there are about 30,000 new products that are introduced every year. 80% of those will actually fail in market. And the question is, why do products fail so frequently? And what is thought and what is written about the most is really that the emotional and perceptual congruency are really key to consumer satisfaction. So making sure that the emotional experience that they have is meeting what their expectations are for that product, making sure that those two things match are really key to the success of a product in the market. And that's where this idea of brand harmony comes in. So with that high failure rate of new market introductions, whether it's new product ingredients or a totally new product, initial successful testing with traditional consumer research is not enough. There tends to be a mismatch between the product experience and the brand expectations. So does the product meet the promise? And this really begs, this imbalance with the high failure rate really begs for a new approach to really better test and prepare for market launch and ensure this idea of brand harmony, that the product does in fact meet its promise from the branding and the marketing message. So to sort of elucidate this a little bit more, I would like to describe a case study. As Marcella said, we discussed this at the Pangbourne meeting in Scotland just this past summer, with the question of, does the product meet the promise? In the type of research that we do, we often do media testing with ads using these physiological and neuroscientific measures, but we also use these measures for looking at the product experience or the sensory experience. For those unfamiliar, the Pangbourne meeting is a sensory conference, so people that are focused on taste and smell and touch and all those things we experience through our body and our senses. And so the question here was, if the marketing mix, in this case an advertisement, would match the product experience, so the experience people have in watching an advertisement, does that emotionally match? Is it congruent with the product experience? So does the product meet the promise that is made in the marketing mix? And in order to do this, we had a protocol for our experiment where the person would smell a fragrance. In this case, it was a fine fragrance. So this was looking at the experience of perfumes against perfume ads. For those of you that have watched a perfume ad, often they are, kind of odd in a lot of ways, and you wonder what's going on there. So the question here is, do they really convey what that perfume is in the experience? So here we had the participants smell the perfume first, and then take a survey about that fragrance to ask some questions about how they felt the fragrance was. And then they watched an ad, and we measured them with the biometrics as well. And then we had them fill out another survey, a fit to concept survey. So one thing I do want to mention here is that we do find it to be very important that when you are using neuroscience or physiological measures, that it's not a replacement for asking people. You still need to ask people because they tell different sides of the story. And that's why we include the surveys here as well, and then we integrate that information later. So after that, we have our results. And as you can see here, as I was describing earlier, often neuroscience and physiological results can be very complicated. So as you can see in these graphs here, for heart rate and attention, it's very active. Now it's actively increasing in attention, but it's a very dynamic effect. But we did find differences between the two fragrances, and those two fragrances were Nomad and Pop. And arousal was also very active, and we found differences there as well. So throughout the exposure, Pop, seen here in the purple, tended to drive more focus and attention than Nomad, which is in the pink, significantly for heart rate and trending for heart rate variability. So this is particularly during the evaluation phase of after that initial response to having a new fragrance. And Nomad was actually more arousing during the evaluation than Pop, significantly found in the GSR. Now looking at the emotional valence from the facial EMG, which are the electrodes on the face, we found that throughout the exposure, Pop tended to drive more positive emotion than Nomad, significantly for facial EMG, for the positive measure. And Nomad tended to drive more negative emotion during the evaluation than Pop. Again, this was significant. And so this is the way we would go through and diagnose some specificities about the different fragrance experience. And that really helps the R&D team. But when it comes to really explaining some of these results more in a way that can help with the explaining it to like a more marketing team and making the business decisions, we want to include some of the other information, right? So here we have some of the words that people use to describe the different fragrances. So this is more of the traditional check all that apply approach and open-end approach. So when people were describing Nomad versus Pop, but you can see here there's not a lot of differences. They're both floral, they're both soothing and comforting, sophisticated and all those things. But when we actually use the mood map to then map out the differences between the two, it becomes very clear that they are separate and distinct. So here you can see that pop is more pleasant, but nomad is more arousing, which we saw in the previous slides, we were able to describe, but those slides tend to be a bit more complicated and noisy. Whereas if we're able to visualize it in this more simplistic way, it becomes a lot more easy to make a business decision and see those differences. But as I said, we also did this to compare to the experience of watching the ad. So when we do ad testing using the physiological and neuroscientific measures, it's really a diagnostic tool to see what is going on as the person is watching the advertisement second by second over the duration of the experience. So then we're able to see what the responses are to specific scenes, and then also look at the overall. So we can see here that for Nomad, the pink fragrance, that there was a lot of, at the start, there was both negative and positive emotion. There's some positive things that were going on where there was an increase in attention. But then there starts to be more negative emotion coming in. And the remainder of the commercial actually becomes quite flat for arousal and attention. And so this wasn't overall a very engaging advertisement. And so then we looked at pop. So what was happening for that commercial? Attention increase, which is something that you do want to see in the very beginning. But then negative emotion also started to increase, which is not as positive. Attention was wavering a little bit. But as you got towards the end of the ad, a lot more negative emotion started to come in. So again, not an ideal advertising experience. And so when we ask the question, how well does the fragrance fit the ad? And this is what would traditionally be done, a fit to concept sort of test. We saw some pretty low results, right? So, just 44% versus 37%. So a little bit better for pop than Nomad, but overall not stellar fit to concepts. So that was in the self-report. Now, if we were to try to just summarize the biometrics and then talk about it with those results from the survey, then we'd be talking again about the significant differences between attention and positive and negative emotion, and all that is very important information. But when it comes to communicating that to larger teams and to maybe more marketing teams or upper management, that is where the value of the mood map really comes in. So here we can clearly see that if we were to look at the fragrance evaluation, which is here in the more positive aroused quadrant of emotional experience, versus the ad evaluation, which is really more in the positive and unaroused quadrant of emotional experience, then we can see that for pop, the ad was less arousing and less positive than the fragrance experience. Whereas for Nomad, again, the ad was less arousing than the neat fragrance. And so there is a disconnect between the fragrance experience and the ad evaluation. And so that can be really important when you're trying to think, does the product, which is the fragrance experience, match the promise, which is what the consumer is told in the ad? So when the person experiences the advertisement and then goes into the store and experiences the fragrance, is there a match there? And from this result, we would say no, there is not. So as you can see, this is a very simple and easy way to visualize that difference, whether there is a match or a mismatch, and make a very clear and confident business decision based on it. And so some key takeaways we'd like you to take away from this information is that mood mapping can be very helpful, not just for brand harmony, but definitely for brand harmony, but it can also be used just to visualize any of these results. Neuropsychophysiological research can definitely help clients understand consumer behavior and consumer decision-making beyond just asking people or the traditional tools that are used in market research. And using this approach of mood mapping for brand harmony or for understanding the consumer experience can really ensure your product meets the promise for marketing success. And most importantly, mood mapping helps to visualize complicated data for actionable results and aid in business decisions. So with that, we open the floor to any questions. So if you have any of those questions, please feel free to type them in to the question space.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And this is Marcella, and I'll help facilitate these questions. One of the first ones we have here is, how would this apply to non-fragrance or non-sensory research? Could it work with other products or final products? Absolutely.
And so the reason this particular case study focused on fragrance was because we did this for the Pangborn Symposium. However, we have used this with looking at total product experience. So anything from someone actually trying on a lotion, for example, or maybe they could be looking at a packaging piece. You don't have to do the comparison between the product experience and the marketing experience. You could just look at the mood map for, just packaging or just the advertisement and just use that as a means to compare maybe a benchmark or two ads, to test prototype or some sort of prototype concept. So really anything that the consumer experiences is something that you can map and measure. So this is a really useful tool for being able to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. And along that same vein, what about food? Effective chewing, mouth actions beyond aroma?
Oh yeah, that's very true, right? So a huge challenge with any physiological measure, neuroscience measure, is, experimental noise or environmental noise. So if the person is chewing, that's going to affect certain measures, like the facial EMG are electrodes on the face. And so if the face is moving, it can create some noise. There are other ways to get around that, though. And the beauty of being able to use something like the gold standard of biometrics is that you can sort of sub out one of the three, right? So one of the three vectors that go into the mood map, you can use a different measure to do, whether it's, subbing in EEG to look at, positive or negative emotional experience, or maybe taking heart rate off of a different location of the body if someone has to use their arms a lot or their hands a lot. It is flexible, and so there are ways to get around those sort of issues that can come up.
Thank you. And from a technology perspective, what about EEG? Can EEG do this, or does it have to be the gold standard biometrics you mentioned?
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be the gold standard. We do find them to be the most reliable and have the most validation in the research. But yes, you can use EEG for some of these things. But then you do have to pay attention to that there's a lot of other noise going on, like I said, with breathing or even eye blinking or other things that can cause activity in the brain. But it is possible to take different aspects of brain activity and use those to map in this way as well.
Okay. Have you done this with fragrance combined with other senses, such as texture instead of ads?
Yes, so that is something we have looked at. It is something that, can be difficult to do though, right? So if you want to tease apart fragrance versus texture on skin, then you want to make sure that those experiences are totally separate. So the person that is smelling wouldn't touch it. The person who is then, touching it is not going to be smelling it, right? So if you really want to see whether or not those things are aligned, you would need to make sure that the person is wearing nose clips, for example, while they're testing it out on their forearm or wherever you are having them test, say, a lotion, or maybe touch a, let's say it's a chair, right? Or a fabric, or a packaging material. So you just would want to, separate those experiences, and then you could map and compare for sure.
Great. And a little bit of a logistical question. How many subjects were there in this case study, and how many are typically needed?
I believe we looked at 30 for this case study. And, the answer we love to give is it depends. But it's a very honest and real answer, because It can depend on how complicated the experience is. So if it's something that is a bit more variable or a bit more noisy, then you will have to up your sample size to have statistical power. If you have a very varied and diverse population that you're looking at, for example, including lots of different countries and men and women and lots of broad age range, then again, you're going to want to up that sample size to accommodate that variability. But if you have a homogeneous sample and a very straightforward experience that you're measuring, then you can certainly go with a lower sample size.
Thank you. And what did you consider positive emotions and what did you consider negative emotions, I believe in reference to the case study?
Yes. So that is actually based on the physiological measure of positive and negative emotions. So I think what the person who's asking this question is referring to is more of a different theory of emotion, which is more the categorical that is often used in, say, facial coding. One of the reasons we prefer this approach over facial coding is for this exact reason. Facial coding is based on 7 basic emotions that are actually pretty limited and tend to be more on the negative side of the emotion descriptors. So this is not based on descriptors at all. Instead, it's physiological emotional response. So it's either positive or negative. It's not any specific words. So we measure those on the face with muscle groups that are associated and have been established and validated as responsive to when the person is feeling more negative emotion or when they're feeling more positive emotion. We'll see changes in activity in those two. So it's not based on specific words at all. And so we don't have to worry about that, if that makes sense. I'm happy if the person who is asking that question would like to reach out and talk about it further. I'm happy to talk about that more.
Thank you. For mood mapping, how many evaluators are commonly needed in order to draw firm conclusions regarding the product?
Yeah, so I think this is the sample size question, similar to the previous. And so, we start right around 30. And then with more complicated research, we need to add more varied population, we need to add more people. So, as I said before, it really depends.
And how does this relate to purchase intent? And along that same lines, have you established like a comparison between the consumer test survey and the biometrics results?
Right. So it's a great question. Everybody wants to know if it's predictive is basically what this question is asking. And so we haven't done a study ourselves to show that it's predictive of purchase intent. But what we do know from the research that has been done is that a big factor that plays into whether someone is to make the second purchase. So, brand harmony is the problem in brand harmony and market success is based on getting that second purchase. So they buy it the first time, they're disappointed. Will they buy it again? How can you get over that hurdle? And so this approach is to help that exact situation. So while we don't have the numbers currently, we haven't done that study. The research that is out there that is available in academia does support that this is a valid way to get towards that purchase intent by having that harmonious experience, making sure that the product meets the promise, meeting the consumer expectations, ensuring all of that by doing measures such as these, whether it's the physiological measures or doing some sort of implicit work can definitely help ensure that that consumer satisfaction.
Wonderful. 2 questions along the same lines here. Can this be used with children and or the youngest age of subjects that can be used in this methodology?
Yeah, so there, like I said before, you can actually switch out different tools within the mood mapping set. And so we have measured infants even. So that is possible to do, but maybe not with all the measures. Or combining with some alternatives. And so, it definitely is possible to measure as young as infants or, in the elderly as well. There's different caveats, of course, that come in when you're dealing with more challenging populations. You want to make sure that you're measuring off of an area where, say a child is not going to start pulling them off, or they're not going to be too big for the child. You might have a size that is appropriate and fits them. But also the advantage that we have in this approach, this sort of multi-dimensional approach, is that you can swap out different tools for the different dimensions. And so being able to make sure that you're getting the dimensions through alternatives can definitely be done.
Great. This is a great question. Generally speaking, should traditional surveys always be conducted following mood mapping?
Not necessarily. However, we do try and recommend getting as clean of a measure through the physiology as possible. And that often means not having the suggestions that often come through the survey. So you can sort of prime or sort of influence the person's experience through the questions that you're asking. And the beauty of doing something like the physiological measures is that you're not getting any of that influence by the wording that is chosen in how you're asking the questions. You're just measuring the raw experience. And so we always recommend to do the survey after the experience, but we can always have that conversation with the client depending, what sort of questions they want to ask, if it's something that they absolutely want to do before the measurement.
Thank you. Do you have all the tools, or do you work with third parties in each case?
We do have all the tools. So everything that Marcella had listed earlier in the slides, we have a very large toolbox. And the very reason for that is because, not all tools are appropriate for all situations. And so you always want to make sure to use the right tool for the right question. And so by having a large toolbox to choose from, we are always making sure that we are taking that approach first, using the right tool for the right question. So whoever you're working with, whether it's us or somebody else, if they tell you that there's only one tool that they use or that they recommend using, we would raise our eyebrows a little bit, because there is no one tool for every situation. And so it is important to have that large toolbox, and we certainly do have our own.
Wonderful. You guys are really asking great questions, and please do keep firing away. Michelle, I got a bunch more for you.
Great. Fire away.
How strong are the order effects over sequential samples on the physiological measures? Are they adequately handled via rotation?
Yes. And so that is very important to do. We do think that it's important to rotate the samples so you don't have any order effects. You can definitely have influence, from fragrance A versus fragrance B, whether it's due to the intensity of the fragrance having an effect on the person's experience of the next one, or, even the mood that is achieved. So definitely you do have to take that into account. And so that is a great question, but definitely something we also design into our studies.
Great. And have you measured the harmony among a fragrance, ads, and packaging? I believe packaging is very important, especially with fragrances.
We haven't done all three, but we've definitely looked at, like two, right? So talking about packaging and talking about that in conjunction with the sensory experience. An example I like to give, it's not a study we did, but example I give when I lecture at universities, because I do a lot of lectures at universities or talks at different conferences. And I give this example because people are most familiar with it. But when you go to the grocery store and you're buying shampoo, if you're in the shampoo aisle and you pick up a bottle of shampoo that is green and it has pictures of fruit on it, and it has the name fructis, right? The fragrance that you're expecting to smell when you pop open that cap, because you do pop open that cap when you're in that shopping aisle, the fragrance you expect is going to be fruity. But if you were to pop that cap of that green bottle with the fruit on it and it smelled like vanilla, this would not be a congruent experience. And it would actually, research shows that it would impact your liking of the product. And so that is definitely a real thing. It's a reality of making sure that the entire product experience is cohesive. The packaging has to match the sensory experience. That has to match the marketing mix. All of that has to, also build that reason to believe in the effectiveness of the product. All those things have to work together to really ensure that, that brand harmony and that market success.
Great. A favorite of mine, an environment question. Of course, measuring biometrics is at least mildly invasive. Might you expect added contextual settings, say smelling flavor aromas in an actual restaurant environment, for example, influence the data?
Yes. So this was a huge topic at Pangborn. So I'm really glad somebody asked it. So context is very important. At HCD, we've been playing around with using different virtual reality sort of situations to induce different context when doing these measures. The topic that was really talked about at Pangborn around this is that when you have someone, say, in a noisy restaurant or in a busy supermarket or busy shopping store, whatever it might be, where they're experiencing the product, that noise actually affects their ability to discriminate. So, for example, there was a study that came out a few years ago that tasting food on an airplane, people rate the intensity of the different flavors as being lower. So it's less salty when you taste it on an airplane than it is when you taste it at home or in a laboratory. And that's because of all that noise, right? Because there's all this other sensory noise going on, you actually can't perceive the saltiness, for example, as intense. And so that goes with all the experiences. So it really kind of depends on what your research question is ultimately. The sort of feeling I got from the answers coming out of Pangborn was that if what you want to do is really differentiate between, say, two prototypes or differentiate between a benchmark and a test sample, testing in that testing facility in that sort of sterile environment, right, where you can really find the minute differences between the two is very important, right? But if you're looking for a more contextual experience, that can certainly be done. But you'd have to also recognize that that experience will be dulled a bit by all the other noises and fragrances and experiences going around the person. But if your research question is centered more around that issue of how are they experiencing this in context, then that can certainly be done.
Thank you. And over what time duration do you collect the physiological data during the evaluative phase?
So again, that depends. Like I said before, that's one of our favorite answers for things, but it depends. To get HRV, heart rate variability, we like to at least have 1 minute of exposure. You can go as low as 30 seconds. So it really just depends on how clean that experience is, but we prefer to have at least 1 minute of exposure. When it comes to the other measures, you can certainly go lower than that. So the experience is pretty short, but we are able to you really want to have whatever that complete experience might be. So you don't want to miss something at the end if you go too short.
Okay, we're going to just take a couple more and then we'll wrap things up. But can you complete this testing with the same participants in case of wanting replications?
Yes, so we have done something like that when you think about before and after, right? So in the case of, say, cosmetics or some sort of personal care product, where you might want to measure people getting a baseline and what that experience is, and then see after, say, 6 weeks of use. How is their emotional experience after 6 weeks of using the product? That's definitely something that you can do. So like a before and after type of measure, you can use those same participants for sure.
Wonderful. And does this work with higher order benefits like confidence or healthy?
No, so that's a really great question. So higher order benefits are those more complicated psychological words. The physiological measures can't tell you specific words like that, but we do have other tools in our toolbox, psychological approaches to look at something like confidence. So for example, if you wanted to see, again, cosmetics is a good example. If you want to see if, using cosmetics for a certain amount of time has an effect on someone's self-confidence or self-esteem, then we do have measures for something like that, but it wouldn't be from neuroscience or physiological, as those can't give you specific words.
Okay, great. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap things up for everybody. And we really appreciate your attendance. As I mentioned earlier, the recording will be mailed out to everybody, but please do follow up with any other questions that we might not have had a chance to get to, or as you're brainstorming over lunch, anything that comes up, we'd be pleased to discuss with you. So thank you again, everybody, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.